Okay, so first I'll go over kind of the blueprint for the session so we can all kind of have an outline of what's going to go on. All right, so we divided ourselves up into three groups of two, and then after each presentation, there will be a 20-minute Q&A session where each group will interview the other group, and then we'll ask specifically for mentor feedback on our solutions and our presentations. And then finally, we will have some just overall further discussion at the end. Youth unemployment is defined by the UN as when young people who are 15 to 24 years old demographically are looking for jobs but cannot find them. It is estimated that over 1 billion young people will be entering the job market next decades. Only half of them will be able to find formal jobs. So this phenomenon will affect members of minority and marginalized groups more than anyone else, which is limited, for example, as young women, indigenous people, and refugees and migrants who will be more, more affected by this phenomenon than anyone else. Unemployment is often lumped together with working poverty as they are caused by similar stressors to the economic system. 90% of all young people live in developing nations, for those in quotation marks, given our previous conversation regarding nomenclature. And then, sorry, just reading off my document. And so understanding that the lack of unemployment opportunities can lead to social exclusion and anxiety, these stressors put already at-risk economies further on edge. Young people are often confronted with barriers and cannot escape the challenges of poverty. Poverty is cyclical, which means that being poor means having a lack of access to the opportunities to dig yourself out of said poverty. So in Korea specifically, because of the pandemic, the service sector has been hit the hardest. The unemployment rate in Seoul currently stands at around 10%, with the retail, hotel, and restaurant industries struggling the hardest. So unfortunately, the service sector is also the sector where most young people enter into the job market. Elsewhere in Asia, the statistics are similar, with Southeast Asia having a lower rate at about 9%, but South Asia rising up to 11%, but they're still pretty similar. I actually found this quote that I thought was quite apt if we're talking about poverty being cyclical, from a author called Terry Pratchett. He's a fictional author, but what he writes has a lot of like real world applications. So let me read this quote to you and then we can get to Regita really quick. So the quote begins. The reason that the rich were so rich, he reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take Boots, for example. He earned $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50, but an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two, and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kind of boots he always bought, and he always wore soles and that were so thin he could tell when he was in the city on a foggy night by just the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have to spend $100 on the boots. Excuse me, I'm all out of sorts today. While the poor man who only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. This was his theory of socioeconomic unfairness. So what this goes to show is that poverty leads to more poverty. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to get at today. For the mentors, do you guys want to just give us a quick overview of who you guys are really quick? Natasha, can you go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kit. Hello, everyone. I'm Nathasha, and I'm from Sri Lanka. And I'm a recent graduate. I started working with Twist Collaborative, which is in the gender lens investing field. And yes, I was a Ask Why Fellow last time. So very excited to meet you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Shoni?
Hi everyone, how are you guys doing? I'm Schoni Song, based here in Seoul, Korea. So I imagine I should be pretty close to where the Korea Center office is right now. Right now, I work at a public affairs and government relations consultancy. So mostly dealing with policy consulting here in South Korea. Part of what we do is also labor relations. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks for having me here.
Wonderful. Awesome. So now we'll get into our first presentation. So it'll be about 10 minutes, and we can save any questions that you may have for the Q&A. And just as a reminder that if you have a question, just put your hand up with the little reaction button, and then I'll moderate that way like normal. All right. Mohammed, can you begin us with your presentation, please?
Yeah, sure. So today I'm going to cover the poverty, war, and like migration. So first, I would like to say, like, according to the Marcus of the like Roman Emperor, he said like poverty is the mother of all crimes. So actually, then what is poverty? Poverty means a person, a group of people, or a society cannot fulfill or unable to fulfill their basic needs or basic necessities of life. So poverty can happen. There are many reasons behind the poverty. For example, like access to the food or clean water, like access to the education, then climate change, and like everything. It happens like when there's like this problem, we can face poverty. But here today, I will try to like start my presentation in a different way. First, I will tell about like war or civil war, then poverty, then migration. And actually everything, these three things is related to the youth unemployment. For example, what is war or conflict? We know everyone. So like war destroy a country's total development, education, business, export, import, economic activities, everything. So when a country face like civil war, the youth like unemployment rate is very high. For example, like recently in Ukraine and Russian war, according to the ILO, International Labour Organization, nearly like 5 million jobs have been lost in Ukraine during this war. So we can say like, yeah, war or civil war can like hamper the youth unemployment, and how it is related to the poverty and like migration. So when a country face this kind of civil war, actually that country's total productivity, economic productivity, growth and development, everything hampered. So people face poverty, for example, lack of education, and it is the main reasons for the youth unemployment, because without proper education, the young people or young generation cannot compete with in the like job sectors. So this is the main problem, and how it is related to the like migration. So we know like there are several kinds of migration, like internal, external, like internal migration, like we are just moving within a country from one place to another place, and external means we move the one country to another country, a new country, I mean. So when a country faces war or civil war, people sometimes are forced to leave their country because of their life, to save their lives or to save their families. So when they enter into a new country, new environment, new atmosphere, new language, everything, new culture, youth people, especially youth people, face difficulties to get jobs. And also like for the poverty, country's government cannot ensure the proper education, proper basic needs. I mean, like education, shelter, and all these things. For this, all the things, people may migrate. for the better life, for the better like education they live. So actually everything is interconnected, like poverty, migration, and like the civil war or conflict. So here is according to the survey, for example, in Syria, the youth unemployment rate before and the during or after the war was like alarming. For example, in 2009 in Syria, the youth unemployment rate was 16.15% before the war. But after the war, it increased. It was 26.22%. And how about in Afghanistan? This is the same picture we can see. For example, before the war in 2000, the percentage was only 17.97%. But during the war or after the war, it was 20.23% in 2020. So what is the possible solution for this youth unemployment? So I think education obviously is important. Like every person should have the access to the education, but not the traditional one. This time, not the traditional one, because every countries, maybe some countries are lagging behind, but every countries have the education, access to the education. But why people are unemployment, especially the youth? Because of the traditional education system. So this time is totally different. I would prefer like project-based education. What is project-based education? So this time, the young generation or young people will learn, not only will learn and observe the information, but they will think creatively with solutions. So they will learn the real life challenges, real world, and they will think creatively, and then they will come with solutions. So what would be the like solutions for this possible problem they will face? I mean, it could be like vocational training. They will not only learn the mathematics language, but they will learn how to solve this problem. So thank you everyone for your patience. Thank you, Kit.
Regita, I know you had your hand up. Can we go to your question?
So we talk about youth unemployment, right? And I think all of us acknowledge that it's a major issue, but through Mohammed's presentation, we come to understand that the structural level of unemployment most of the time is not caused by youth. It's not because young people are lazy to not be employed, right, at a major level, especially in war-driven countries or countries where there's civil war and all of these inequalities going on politically. So because we have Schoni, who's a policy consultant, as well as Nathasha, who works in the Generalist Investing Forum, meaning you have access to the investors who can have an influence in the political discussions made by, like governments and political parties. I was just wondering, like, is there a possibility, or do you think there is a possibility that internationally we could have like framework that prevents wars from happening? Because like, of course, I understand that there are organizations like UN that, does a lot of work in preventing war. But when it comes to frameworks, oftentimes there is a conflict because the national policies don't always comply with the international standards. So I was just like really curious, do you think there is ever a possibility that in the future we'll have policies that can be very practically implemented by countries, political parties, and that could prevent war, which in return would prevent the rate of unemployment increasing?
I think maybe just like my opinion in terms of can we actually have that framework? In the gentleman's field in itself, it's really difficult for us to even convince like traditional investors to incorporate gender into the investing field. So I think kind of going on that note, it's probably going to be a lot more difficult to have almost like a universal framework when it comes to like youth employment and to like prevent wars per se. Also because there's like cultural elements to it. There's, it differs according to what country it is. And so having a universal framework is, I don't think, going to solve the problem. But Schoni, do you want to maybe add on, and then I can think a bit more and add on to it? Thank you.
I think this question is a bit layered, and we have to think of it in terms of that layered approach as well. And what I mean by that is just taking the Ukraine crisis as an example. a lot of industries, but it's also true that certain sectors and segments profited enormously from the war. I'm not just talking about defense contractors. I'm talking about the raw materials market, energy market, so on and so forth, right? So I think these things always, I mean, wars don't happen in a vacuum, and macroeconomics is always a question of with multiple variables in play. So I think it's really difficult to come up with a multilateral solution where everyone gets a say in the matter. So that's hard. That's part A. Part B, so how can we maybe go about solving this problem, or at least try to get it started, is before my gig at Asia Society, I used to work in a small think and do tank, we used to call it, called the East-West Institute, which is now gone. It's been absorbed by, I think, the Stimson Center, which is based out in DC, in Washington. And what we used to do back there was trying to prevent conflict. And how to do that is there are three sort of approaches to manage or prevent conflict. And one is track one diplomacy, which is diplomacy happening at the government level. So government versus government, negotiating things out. And then track two diplomacy is usually what happens when you have like civilians involved, right? Or former officials going in. What we did there was an interesting hybrid of those two approaches, which was called a track 1.5. So getting both incumbent officials from the State Department, as well as, say, business elites, former military officers, and so on and so forth, all joining in a forum or a military dialogue to sort things out. And that way, you kind of get more views into the solution-making process or decision-making process. But it also involves the government heavily enough so that it doesn't just become a vacuous discussion in the private sector. So that's just my 2 cents.
Okay, so as we are talking about youth who are in the fragile settings involved into conflict, migration, and poverty. So in my opinion, I think that instead of just talking about the need of employment for them, we need to focus on talking about ensuring sustainable employment for them. So ensuring for them decent workspace. So I'm just wondering that how youths from those contexts could be mobilized for sustainable employment, and how can we engage them in peace building and social cohesion, improving social cohesion, as this is one of the leading components of sustainable employment for them. So that's my question.
Before anyone answers Ritu's question, I just wanted to add something to that. Because like when we think about this conflict situations, right? Like if you think about the Maslow's needs of like hierarchy of needs, like if you're trying to survive, like if you're like fighting for your life, like does like sustainable employment become a concern for the youths or the people there? Because when you're fighting literally for your day-to-day life, I was just like wondering in that context. So when you say sustainable employment, I was just wondering, because that's like again a very like multi-layered issue, right? Like when it comes to providing those. So before someone answers, I just wanted to add to that, like that, to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I agree with you, Reggie, on that, because, like, even in our countries, there's a lot of like this. For example, when I choose a job, I want it to be aligned with my like ethical values, and then, for it to be a sustainable, a green job. But then there's also limited options, and I can only imagine how limited the options are when it comes to a conflict zone. So I think, yeah, you definitely have to take that into account as well. But there are also like these startups that I've seen that kind of utilizes like refugees or youth from like refugee camps and so on. So I think there's blueprints out there. Just not sure if it has worked yet because it's still in the early stages. Yeah.
Actually, going off of what Natasha was saying, I actually applied for a job recently with an organization like that. And I think they're doing some really good work in that field in terms of sustainable employment for people from conflict zones. They're an organization based out of the US, I think, called Nathasha, and which means like we speak in Arabic. And so what they do is they hire people from conflict zones. I think they specifically focus on Iran, Gaza, and Sudan, I think. And they go into refugee camps, and they teach displaced people language teaching skills. And so then these people now become online tutors for their native languages, and it acts as a way of building an economy for displaced and migrant peoples in a way that still, I guess, allows them to, utilize their own expertises from what they know, but also still kind of build a sustainable architecture for, kind of creating some kind of sustainable employment while they're, in the migratory process. Because, as we know, like refugee camps can last for years, if not generations. And so kind of creating some sort of like, I don't know quite how to describe it, but it's like, the, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna leave it there. So, but yes, I think like there is a framework already there that has been quite successful. They've been, I think, interviewed in Forbes. I think that's where I found them. But yeah, just as a side note to what you were saying, Natasha.
Actually, I have one follow-up question with that, because whenever we talk about sustainable employment, the thing that comes into our mind is that inclusiveness, right? That we are always trying to be more inclusive in each sector. So particularly in this kind of settings, fragile settings, my question is that how inclusive is the recruitment process for jobs need to be? Because there will be the vulnerable youths who are the victims of the conflict, right? And they might not be enough educated to or capable enough with skill and knowledge. So if we make the recruitment process inclusive, then will we be able to meet the labor market's demand?
I want to add to that. That's very interesting because I actually have seen job applications of vacancies that like particularly restricts, like even nationality wise. And I know this is like a political, like at a very deeper level of politics, right? And that's very complicated for us to grasp. But like you said, mention inclusivity, especially if we're talking about providing employment opportunities to youth from vulnerable communities, especially in the war-torn, war conflict zones, right? Like, how do we put that? I personally haven't seen many instances where, like, because of a person's country or nation being in a politically tense state, their application being rejected or not even being admitted. So maybe, Sean, because you work again in the policy department, I was just wondering, like, do you think that, again, is this very unrealistic to expect more companies to be more inclusive in accepting more of these youths? Because the skills, I think skills-wise, it's not that, that you're trying to compromise their skills. It's not that. It's that sometimes you're being rejected in the first place because of your nationality, because of, the place that you're in. So just like, do you have something to add to that?
I'm always wondering about the same thing. Don't have an answer to that question, to be honest. And to sort of unpack what I do a little further, what we do is not trying to change behaviors of businesses necessarily, because they're our clientele. What we're trying to do is trying to change the behaviors of governments, bureaucracies, changing policies and legislative arrangements and structures altogether. So in that space, I think there's still a lot of work that South Korea needs to do. South Korea is not exactly the most inclusive community country out there, especially when it comes to accepting displaced refugees or whatnot. So there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done, but public perception, I think, has to change first before that policy shift can happen. So I think that's something to be given some serious thought to.
Shoni, going off of that, I'm wondering, what's the situation like in South Korea, specifically for North Korean refugees or, I guess, expatriates? I'm not sure what the official term nowadays is for.
It used to be called defectors. I think now, we use them interchangeably. I think either or is fine. If I'm not mistaken, there should be more north of 100,000 North Korean defectors now here in South Korea living here as South Korean citizens. And most of them, I think more than 80% of them successfully make it into, the sort of South Korean establishment, so to speak, finding a job and securing a livelihood, so on and so forth. But I think a small percentage still finds it really difficult to make that adjustment, especially because of the gap in terms of the social structures between what North Korea represents and what South Korea is, which is a liberal democracy and a capitalist country. So a kind of structure that they're not entirely acclimated to. And that takes a lot of time. But I think one thing that maybe the Korean government can do more of is there is usually a training and assimilation sort of workshop period that is attached to when they first arrive here in South Korea. I think it takes about 6 months, maybe up to a year of training for them to get used to South Korean culture, language, and etiquettes and all that. I think we could offer more of that training and education in case that isn't enough for some of the defectors and expatriates. But again, it comes down to the issue also of budget and money. So that's something that needs to be sorted out in the political circles. But I'm not sure that the political parties, especially the main two parties, would be willing to put aside funds and budget for things like that.
Sure. So my question was, in countries where we are still not very inclusive of global citizens, or let's say youth, we are not used to youth taking up high positions in the labor market, the people who already have been holding on to their jobs for over a decade or for multiple years, they usually have this aversion towards people who newly have entered the same job or the labor market. So are there ways to combat this and have a greater cohesion between people who have newly entered like a job and people who have been there or who have been doing their job for, let's say, a long time?
I think if I talk about it from my context, because I think this is very different, like context to context, country to country. In my country, that's a major issue right now, that like the government is actually, and the king has literally commanded to change, because in Bhutan as well, when it comes to people who are already in the jobs, they're not willing to retire. These are mostly rich, powerful men who want to hold their position of power, who don't want to give up that. So that's happening here in this country, and that's why there was a whole reform that's taking place in the labor sector, where majority of the people in the upper rankings are asked to forcefully retire because they're not retiring. And I personally think that's a result of corruption. And that's, like I said, I feel like you cannot expect young people to enter the market and join cohesively if the people at the top who've been there for a longer period of time are not opening up this space to them. And oftentimes that is a I think issue, right? People who are in position of power do not want to let go of that power, and so you don't want to be replaced. And so in our country, the reforms are taking place in the form of even RCSE, which is supposed to be the civil service examination. Starting from there's a structural change in the policies, right? And also there's a change in the policies that are for the civil service servants, because before, I think the policies were very much more lenient, right? When it comes to retirement, the clauses were very much favorable to the ones at the upper ranking, but not that had a consequence, or that had a negative consequence to people entering the market. But now there is a reform taking place. So I personally think from my country's context, the way I see it being feasible to have that good cohesion is if the policies in place are implemented, and if especially there's a monitoring of the people at a higher level or who've been in the job for a long period of time, if the monitoring of their performance is being evaluated time and again. Because, like I said, I think there's more to do in that sector than in the sector of young people joining in the job. Because as young people, I think we all can agree that when we first join a job sector, we have more enthusiasm, more passion, more energy, right? But oftentimes we get collapsed, oftentimes we get demotivated because the structure of work that we're joining in is very hierarchical or very rigid. and doesn't allow us any agency for creativity space. So I think from my country's context, that's how we are doing it right now. And I'm looking forward to the change.
I think that really begs the question, should there be a age or timeout limit where okay, I think especially, I come from the musical sector where if you get a position in an orchestra, you stay there for life. You there is no entry into the job market. And so, should there be, okay, you've done 20 years of service, goodbye, or you've hit a certain age, time to retire. But how do you balance, we're talking about what Binu mentioned, the differences in between the needs of the older generation versus the young generation. You can't just kick out all the older people, they still have, economic livelihoods to consider, right? So how do we balance those two with not just what Gita was saying, just the overwhelming, just static, I guess, nature of some of these positions where there's no mobility for young people in the labor market.
Speaking of, I think, this issue in the labor market, I think one thing that needs to be sort of pointed out is seniority is really no guarantor of merit, but neither is youthfulness a guarantor of innovation, right? And I think oftentimes that point gets lost in a tense conversation about this rivalry and tension that exists between the young and old generations. And we often tend to sometimes conflate those things as well. And I think it's important to attain both, equity and fairness on the one hand, while not foregoing or sacrificing competitiveness or economic robustness or dynamism on the altar of those fairer and more just society. So I think the tension between young people joining the workforce and the seniors that have been there for a while is kind of mirrored also by the dilemma presented by disruptive technologies in a way. If you can sort of think about how technologies have in many instances replaced existing jobs and existing technologies, but those losses have not been permanent job losses if you look at it historically. So I think it's important to convince people that these things, these disruptive changes, innovation, or new people entering the workforce does not create permanent unemployment, but rather it opens up new possibilities. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had on a societal level.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to cut this conversation off. We are on a time limit. So if it's okay with everyone, can we move to presentation number 2, group 2? Perfect. Whoever's presenting for group number 2, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody. Actually, my presentation is about unpaid internships and the barriers to entering the labor market, which basically we just discussed some of them. And so basically about the issue of unpaid internships, we can all agree so far that we count on youth to lead us into a future of sustainable and sustainable development and decent work. But achieving these goals requires that we first ensure the youth around the world have adequate access to education and training. So in this sense, the first problem that we've encountered was unpaid internships and the fact that they are not accessible for everybody. And the value of internship is undeniable. It basically teaches young people marketable skills. It builds professional networks, and it helps a student test drive careers. And they matter a great deal to a student's future, almost as the credentials that they have. So in an ideal world, every single student will have an internship at some point in their educational journey. But that is not the case. unfortunately. And in the case of unpaid internships, well, we all know the archetype of the unpaid intern. Basically, they spend their days getting coffee and doing the work no one wants to do, while receiving little or no recognition from the full-time staff. And this is justified as a means of getting a foot in the door, like they call it, and gaining industry experience that will hopefully one day lead to successful careers, right? But in critical thinking about unpaid internships, we can see that they are nowadays out of date and exploitative. Interns are young, lacking in experience, of course, and often seen as powerless. And this makes them vulnerable to exploitative working conditions. As interns, youth are less likely to voice their concerns out of fear of jeopardizing any future opportunities. Well, what has been done about this issue? Well, so far, unpaid internships are illegal in some countries, such as Canada, for example, but this does not apply to students who are completing internships to receive academic credits, right? And the problem with unpaid internship among students is that those who are less financially stable simply can't have the flexibility to spend, I don't know, like their summer volunteering with an organization that they are passionate about. And this at the same time creates a system that favors students with generational wealth and economic stability while alienating those from less fortunate backgrounds. So in order to create spaces where young people can have a tangible impact on the conditions they live in, and for organizations to intentionally include diverse youth perspectives in their practices and work, internships need to be made accessible for youth of all demographics. In the contrary, paid internship opportunities can be crucial to create safe engagement spaces for youth from marginalized communities, such as those from the Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, disabled, and from other social and racial groups. So what can be done in the case of the internships are about students who wants to receive just academic credentials. They need to receive academic credentials. In this case, in the terms of best practices for internships, these are some of the policies that can be enforced further in some countries where they do not apply. For an internship to be legitimate, according to the National Association of Colleges and Employers, the experience must be an extension of the classroom. So basically, a learning experience that provides for applying knowledge gained in the classroom. It must not be simply to advance the operation of the employer or be the work that a regular employee will routinely perform. The skills or knowledge learned must be transferable to other employment settings. Also, the experience should have a defined beginning and end, and a job description with desired qualifications should be made. And also, there should be, the employer should define the learning objectives and goals related to the professional goals of the student's academic coursework. And well, these are just some of the policies that should be taken into consideration. And for the employers when they employ youth, especially in the case of the ones who need to get some academic credits. And I guess one of the solutions that I mentioned is like try to make policies in order to ban or make unpaid internships illegal, but of course, this cannot be applied to all the contexts in all countries. So in that case, one option should be to enforce these policies, right? And well, the other topic that I was going to discuss about is the barriers to entry in the labor market. So as I mentioned before, being young is associated with having relatively limited work experience, less well-developed personal and professional networks, and limited knowledge of the labor market. And these youth-related barriers are particularly important when advertised jobs require significant levels of experience. And this might be especially severe when the formal job market is not expanding and employers can reduce the risk by hiring older and more experienced workers. Also, the lack of knowledge of the labor market would be also expected to make the identification of employment opportunities more difficult. Finally, limited experience and precarious employment contracts mean young people are also more vulnerable to layoffs when economic recessions happen. So doing my research, I can summarize some of the barriers that youth faces when trying to enter the labor market, and they can be divided into formal and informal barriers. Accordingly, so formal barriers are usually gender or age restrictions, and this can be related to the insurance carried by the employers. Another barrier could be the requirement for a specific professional qualification, for an excessive number of years of previous experience, and also the economic conditions. And some of the informal barriers could be the reputation of the university, college, or school, lack of experience, the employer attitudes. For example, some employers see young people as a higher risk than experienced or older employees. And this can be due to concerns about young people's work ethic and motivation. Also, lack of work experience, maturity, and potential need for more intensive training. So soft skills, which include motivation and attitude, are not always easy to teach or measure, but they are highly valued by employers. Also, education and training, as we previously talked about. So ensuring young people are encouraged to focus on training for occupations where growth is forecast is also important, so that they have the skills the employment market demands. And education and training can be provided by organizations beyond the traditional educational system. So employers, industry training organizations, and communities can offer alternative training programs. Some of other barriers could be the quality of referees, the gender, religious, or ethnic discrimination, political leanings or affiliations. And on the other hand, we also found that internet and social media are also important in the identification of opportunities. However, access can be limited, mainly to those who can afford to be connected and or know how to use the technology. So this represents another informal barrier to access. In terms of the solutions to this issue, we as a youth need to engage with the agenda of supporting youth in a way that enables us to obtain skills and experience to improve employment and livelihood prospects within the informal and the formal sector. Also, we should work with employers and governments to promote recruitment processes that are open, transparent, and non-discriminatory, and also support processes that strengthen the labor market laws and governance to provide the right balance for incentives in terms of encouraging employers to work with the formal sector and to provide fair working conditions to employees. So that's basically some of the solutions that we found. That can be carried out by young people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Valeria. Does anyone have any questions right off the bat? Yes, Vinu.
I wanted to ask this to Nathasha specifically, but anyone who wants to answer. Valeria talked about how unpaid internships usually are seen as a cause of exploitation for the youth, and a lot of people fall for it because there's a lack of awareness regarding better financial practices, or they are not financially literate per se. So are there ways that we can introduce the concept of financial literacy to youth at an early stage so that we can save them from this concept of unpaid internships, or help them make better financial decisions?
Yes. So unpaid internships is actually one of the topics that I'm very passionate about. I used to have mixed emotions about this because the current job that I have is also something that I got. The opportunity is something that I got through an unpaid internship that I did before, like through the network I found. But then I think with the last year and how everything has been, I think it's important to just note that unpaid internships does create like a systemic barrier when it comes to entrance for a lot of youth, especially ones with, like not enough financial stability. And to answer your question, Venu, yes, I think definitely like being financially literate would kind of help us be more aware as to, especially when we are entering the workforce at first, to see how, like what your economic worth is, because I think we, as youth, underestimate that. We all have, imposter syndromes when we are first getting into jobs, and we all kind of underestimate ourselves a lot. And employers do sometimes take advantage of that and exploit you in that sense. So yes, to your question of we need to get financial literacy out there, and we need to make sure that at a young age, or like even if it's at university level, I think it still helps to have financial literacy as part of either course curriculum, or it is a life skill at the end of the day. I feel like most of your financial decisions later in your life are based on what you learn during your like young days, like 20s, 30s, what financial knowledge that you gain. It kind of stays with you. So yes, for sure. It's just the issue is with how do we get it out there, and how do we make sure that the policymakers or the government, the schools, universities know that it's important. There's definitely kind of waves these days on like awareness on financial literacy, but it's towards the West. It hasn't reached the Eastern Hemisphere, like the Asian countries yet. But I hope that it does. And I do have plans, but they're taking a backseat right now because of like my current job. But hoping to in the next year to kind of actually start working on getting this out there to universities, and to making sure that young people know that, know not to get or not to be exploited by greedy companies and so on. But yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Yes,
that's much a solution. Yeah.
I think I'm going to be a devil's advocate when I say this, but I don't think unpaid internships are going to end. There'll still be unpaid internships because the demand, because the lack of financial literacy, but also if you have the privilege to do an unpaid internship, and if that unpaid internship is going to return you with a proper job and skills, of course, that becomes a motivation for people to apply, right? But I think what's worse than unpaid internship is like underpaid internships, or underpaid starting jobs, whereby you can't even complain saying I'm not even being paid, right? And I think that's even more difficult position to be in, because like when you're in an unpaid internship, you are going with the mindset, okay, I'm gonna be underpaid, I'm not gonna be paid, but you also have a strategy, or you're thinking that okay, maybe this unpaid internship is gonna give me the skills, connections, network, maybe the possibility of being in a company for a long time, things like that. But usually it's the underpaid internships that are limited for a certain period and that don't extend to a career. And those are the places where, as young people who are trying to navigate your career, who are trying to meticulously fight for a place in this very competitive world of like jobs and services, you are in a way manipulated to like be like, okay, I'm being paid, right? And you're overworked. So again, because I myself have done internships before, and I've been in unpaid internships, underpaid internships, good internships. So I've noticed that in an unpaid internship, I at least had the seat to say like, okay, like the mentality that I'm not being paid, or that, okay, I can even say it out loud. But when I was being underpaid and overworked, that's where I was like, am I just being too much? Am I just like not fit for this work? But I realized that it was not the case. It was because exploitation was so major in places where the payment was less. So I think that's something I wanted to just share here, because I think it's important to acknowledge.
Just to add to that, actually. Sorry, go ahead, Venu. No, you can go ahead.
No, I just quickly wanted to add that I've seen this pattern in India, and maybe this exists in other countries as well. But generally, when employers try to cut their costs, what they do is, instead of hiring like full-time employees, they just make hire a group of interns and, give them underpaid jobs and get all the work done. So that way they're cutting costs and making the most of the youth. So I think it's really important to address that problem as well. So thank you, Rita, for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think what I don't understand is that how employers don't understand that it's not good for them in the long run, because when you have, for example, underpaid employees or underpaid youth working, there's definitely going to be a high turnover. They are going to go look for better opportunities, and so it's in the long run, it's not good for them. So, yeah. Not sure how to translate that into actual actionable steps, but yeah, just to add.
That makes me think about, I'm not sure exactly what to call it, honestly. It's when you apply for a job and you have like, what's your requested salary in and this feels it feels exploitative, and I can't explain how, especially as like young people, when we're entering into the job market, especially for entry-level positions or internships. I feel like this isn't something we should know. And you don't want to overball the salary range, because you don't want to be kicked off the listing, but you don't want to underball the listing either, because they're just going to exploit you. And so I'm wondering, I guess, with your experience with financial literacy, Natasha, are there any ways around that in terms of teaching people the value of certain kinds of labor, or in terms of working on the other side of working with corporations to be give salary ranges, don't hide, you have to disclose salary, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there's changes. Sean, did you want to go first, or?
Go ahead. It's fine. I was just about to add that, isn't that exactly what's happening in New York?
Yes.
Starting, I think starting in November. So it must have happened already.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's roughly 4 or 5 million private sector workers in New York City. And starting in this month, they're now going to be required, the employers are now required to specifically list the salary ranges of the jobs that they're posting. So that's a step in the right direction. And I think we have to hire more firms like ours to force governments to change their laws and legislations.
That was the small change I was going to refer to. But yeah, there's small changes happening. But then I think it's definitely a red flag when you don't say the salary range out there, because that needs to be up for discussion. And this is more of a joke, but then I tell my friends as well to kind of always apply for jobs and give the highest you can, and apply and then give the highest expected salary, so that other people will get a better pay grade and that sort of thing. But anyways, to your point on being financially literate, I think that's kind of what I meant as to knowing your economic worth. And as practical solutions, there's websites for example, Glassdoor, that you can go and check for if it's let's say program coordinator, project manager, you can go and check for the usual price ranges and salary ranges and stuff. So that helps. But then I think also another thing that helps is to kind of be more transparent about your salary. I think that's something that we need to work on. I've done this experiment on LinkedIn. I've reached out to a lot of people and asked them asking about their job and how much salary do you get. And if you think of the statistics, about 9 people out of 10 don't like to disclose their salary. And I'm sure there's reasoning behind it, but I think it helps to be more transparent, especially with kind of bringing my gender expertise in. I think there's a lot more, like there's a gender gap for sure in terms of like salaries as well. So it really helps, especially like within women as well, if we are more transparent about our salaries, especially as young people, so that we know that we are actually getting paid for what it's worth or what we are worth. Yes. So it's just a few points that I wanted to add. Thank you.
If I can just add something real quick, and it's just something that crossed my mind right now, I think it's also important to carve out the firms and institutions and employers that are really struggling and they can't afford to offer paid internships or paid apprenticeships, and therefore have to opt for the option of unpaid internships. Or are we talking about a Fortune 500 company that has, profits to spare, but they're just doing it for the sake of, saving costs and just because they can do it? I think those two lie in completely different purviews, and we have to treat them differently as well, especially when we're coming up with policies and implementing them as well.
No, I'm actually wondering, Larry, you mentioned a lot about like informal education as a barrier to entry, and I'm wondering how we can more formalize the recognition of informal education, in terms of, recognizing that, okay, you don't have to have a top tier university degree to have the requirements necessary. You don't have to have your A levels. You don't have to have whatever. You can have all of these different ways of becoming an expert or becoming a valued employee. That's not necessarily the, tried and true way. And so I'm wondering what you guys think about, like, in terms of solution building, what is a way we can more formally recognize the informal ways that people become like valued members of a workforce, especially given that with like poverty, you don't have a lot of access to these formalized opportunities. If no one has anything else further, we can go forward on, I think, group 3. Are you guys ready to present?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks, Kit. So for the third section of this presentation, it's me and Ritu. We're going to talk about education access in relation with youth unemployment and from a gender perspective. I will be talking about like the real ground realities of like why it's important, or what are the problems that we have when it comes to education and why are we bringing it up. And Ritu is going to actually talk about like how providing gender transformative education can actually make a very big difference, as both of us are like living proof of that. And our university, I think, is a really good example of that gender transformative education being put in place. So far we've been talking about like unemployment, right? And when it comes to the structural issues or the political issues of war, displacement, that's very major, right? And that's something that I think as individuals we can't really tackle it. That's like a very global issue there. But when it comes to the minute levels or in an individual level, it's really important to understand that education is like the answer, right? And so far, Mohammed and even Kit did mention this time and again about education, like in their presentations too. So I feel like it's really important to understand that education is a right, should be a right to everybody, but not everybody has access to it. I think people present here in this room, despite our differences in our culture and our backgrounds, we are still, I will use the word privilege now because when you look at the statistics, it is a privilege to be able to educate ourselves at this level, right? To have high education. So something that we all can acknowledge, and also acknowledge the fact that this is not the ground reality for people all around the world, even people our own age, and even in our own countries. So if I can just give you some statistics, so this is from UN, United Nations report, and I think UN does a good job, especially UNICEF, in trying to at least collect the data. And I'm sure, again, there's more, but this is like the data that has been collected by United Nations over the years. Worldwide, it's said that 129 million girls are out of school. Like, women make up more than 2/3 of the world's 796 million illiterate people. And actually, again, this is a research that states that every additional year of primary school increases a girl's eventual wages by 10 to 20%. So like right now, when we talk about unemployment or employment, like the crisis, right, we see that even in a higher level of employment, we see there's gender gap, gender disparity. But the very fact that women and girls are not even given the same access to education, to be at that level of even qualification, that in itself is a very big barrier, right? So the playing field is not equal. And that's where we need to really emphasize our focus on making sure that the education that is being provided is, first of all, accessible to everyone, and is also gender transformative. Because of course, again, I think despite coming from different countries and different backgrounds, we can all acknowledge that there are gender disparities even in our own schools. And a lot of research does suggest that the gender norm present in most countries which are patriarchal tends to reinforce that in schools, even in the pedagogy, in the way that they're teaching the subjects, right? Like when it comes to girls and boys, the gender roles that one is expected to perform in schools in a way also influences boys and girls to act differently, to have different levels of confidence, different levels of expectation, different levels of ambitions. There was a research that stated that in South Asia, boys are given more chance to be in charge of playgrounds, be leaders in playgrounds, whereas girls were expected to clean classes, to be in charge of the more maternal or feminine side of the things. Girls are in schools are often restricted to play masculine sports in many conservative societies, and that in itself again restricts a lot of young girls to even have this idea that, okay, I could be, let's say, a football player, a national player, international player, all of these things. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, in education, there is a lot of loopholes, a lot of barriers that in some restricts women and girls from accessing education. Now, if you shift ourselves from this binary lens, right, of women and boys and girls, we see that when it comes to children who don't fit into the gender roles, meaning the queer children, children from the LGBTQI community, they themselves don't find it, they don't have enough safe space in the schools, in the education institutes to even have the same access to education as the others. They're stigmatized, tabooed, shamed, bullied, and that reduces their confidence there. And again, even in Bhutan, it's a common fact that most people from the transgender community drop out of school from a primary level because of the bullying that they cannot tolerate. And that means that when they reach it at a later stage of their lives, they're not able to actually even apply for those economic positions of jobs because they don't have the qualifications in the first place. Right. So this is where gender transformative education comes into play. And I'm just going to read out the definition because I think this is the key to making sure that education is accessible to all, and education plays a big role in making sure unemployment is a lesser issue, or that it does the most of it. So gender transformative education is actually the education that seeks to utilize all parts of an education system, from policies to pedagogies to community engagement, to transform stereotypes, attitudes, norms, and practices by challenging power relations, rethinking gender norms and binaries, and raising critical consciousness about the root cause of inequality and systems of oppression. And I think this is very needed because for schools and education institutes to assume that everyone is being treated the same, everyone comes from the same background, has the same experience, is, I think, a very wrong move, right? Because you're not acknowledging the difference that people have. And by not acknowledging the differences that people have, you're not going to be able to come up with solutions that cater to the differences. And that's where gender transformative education comes into play. And to do that, there are some steps that, again, I've researched, right? And then I'm going to mention it here, and Ritu's going to then explain about it from the culture perspective of us as Asian University women student. So of course, training of the teachers, the TOT, training of the teachers, because the teachers who are teaching in this classes need to be trained, right? I'm sorry. The first thing is policies. The policies in schools need to be gender sensitive, especially even if that means when it comes to bathrooms, right? To be acknowledging of the fact that there are children who fit beyond the binary realms of boys and girls. those things, like, if like there are policies that are inclusive enough to accommodate children of different backgrounds, that is the first way to go. Secondly, training of the teachers to make sure that those policies are implemented in the classroom by those teachers, because apart from parents, teachers play a big role in influencing a children's mindsets and like their whole well-being. So it's important to train them constantly and to even monitor their performances. Oftentimes we I don't know if that's a common thing in different parts of the world, but oftentimes in our region, teachers are given like a huge amount of respect, right? But that means that they are also forgiven, or they're not held accountable for the action that they do that could be very traumatizing to the children. So constant monitoring of their their strategies of teaching, I think is really important, because with the time and age that we're living in right now, it's important that all of us are constantly updating our skills. So teachers, I think, should be given an emphasis on that as well. The third thing is strengthening institutional partnerships between government, civil society, grassroots, youth, and women's movement. I think it's really important as well, because advocacy plays a big role. And if you're being able to advocate that through mainstream media, through the policies, even in the political sectors, that is being reinforced in the network of people, in the schools, in the child's environment. And so now I'm going to ask Ritu to talk about our experiences, because we do come from a university that is about empowering women and that has given an opportunity to educate women from different parts of the world. And of course, I think the education system that is in place is very, very, very innovative and very impactful as well, because Nathasha and me, Ritu, we come from the same university, and I think we've seen a great change in our lives. So Ritu, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Rigita. So thank you for pointing out the importance of getting equal access to education for both boys and girls, particularly for girls. So often it has been said that access to education, that is a fundamental to the development and growth of youths. But the question is that, is it really applicable in this globalization era? Right? There need to be, I think that there need to be some modifications. The sentence needs to be that equal access to quality education, that is fundamental to the development and growth of today's youths. So if we use a gender lens to bring attention to social inequalities that exist in our society, we find a huge gap between boys and girls in the education sector, particularly in our developing countries. So just giving a statistic, that a recent UNESCO report which commits to the principle that men and women must get the benefits equally from the development, and that report focuses on SDG 4 and 5. SDG 4 is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. And SDG 5 is talking about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So from the report, the good news we have received is that overall the world has achieved parity in all levels of education except for the higher education, the tertiary education sector. And the bad news is that there are still the disparities at national and regional levels that we are facing, and which get worse and worse at high levels of education. So the disparity between male and female, that the leadership generally increases with the level of schooling, how much quality education we have received. So in this case, I think that girls from marginalized communities still are lagging. As we move towards the SDG goals, learning for all means ensuring that all the students are getting the access to quality education, and not just the most privileged gain the knowledge and skills that they need from the schools. The major challenge here is that access remain for the disadvantaged population, the marginalized population at the primary level, secondary level, tertiary level. That is still there. Exist there. The challenges are still there. So for that, I think that we must eliminate the barriers that keep girls from the marginalized communities, from ethno-linguistic minorities, from attaining as much as education they can have as other population groups. So without confronting the challenges, without confronting the equality and equity issues, it will be really impossible to achieve the goal, the objective of learning for all. And eventually it will be impossible to make this huge population competent enough to cope up in this globalized world. So one example that can be given is about our Asian University for Women, that is a liberal university. that is giving the gender transformative education to the girls, which is based in Bangladesh. This university is trying to create a big platform to bring the girls like me, who are from marginalized groups from different corners of Asia. So we have refugee students who are not supposed to get the chance to higher education. We have girls from garments factories, and we have girls from indigenous communities like me who never dreamt of even going for higher education and empowering themselves. So this kind of opportunity, I think that must be given for the girls, to the girls. Because when they will receive the quality education, when they will receive the education that will boost their leadership skills, that will make them capable to cope in this world by gaining skills and knowledge, that is how I think that the youth unemployment we can reduce the youth unemployment. So that's all from my side, and I would like to hear from you perspectives.
I just wanted to add something to it. Like, so not trying to, I think, blow the trumpet of a university in that sense, but I feel like the structure of education that we received was, I think, very unique to us. I think coming from developing countries, my high school experience and my university experience were two different, very contrasting experiences. And I really, like, I think the person that I am right now, the confidence that I might have, or the leadership skills that I have been able to gain is because in my university, I was introduced to a really safe and enabling environment to learn, where the teachers were like not just like teachers teaching you, but were friends, companions, supporters, mentors, who were really boosting each of us like differently, at an individual level as well. And also where I was able to find a network of women who came from different walks of life, different backgrounds, but nonetheless had similar visions of like how we wanted to go about after the university. And I feel like that kind of community, safe community in education, is really important to build the confidence of people that are from marginalized communities or minority communities, not just limited to women and girls, but also the LGBTQI communities as well.
Absolutely. Do you guys have any questions? First off?
Not a question, but I wanted to give a bit of context as to in like the Sri Lankan context. So we do have free public higher education. So we have that. And I think you can argue that that would give a lot of opportunities for young girls as well, coming from marginalized communities and others to get, access to education. But then that stops there, like the empowerment kind of stops there. Because what happens is it gets reduced to a number where it's like, oh, there's so many young women in universities now, finishing universities now, and all that is great. That's awesome. But what happens is when, like within the universities, first of all, they get bullied, and so they get bullied, and then when they're out of universities, what happens is they don't have enough opportunities, as in like job opportunities, because there's inherent like gender biases in like the hiring process as well. So just wanted to give a bit more context as to even sometimes with access to education, like in Sri Lanka, what we do, and our government leaders are also kind of, boasting about it. Like we have this many young women, like more young women going to university than like men as well. But then it really doesn't mean much. Like you have to really think about like what next and how it all connects, and if it actually is impacting the way people think that it is. Yeah, just a bit of context.
Okay, so just a little solution or a little concept that India has with respect to what Nathasha said, that empowerment, especially women and queer empowerment, just ends with education itself, and it is difficult to incorporate that into the working world or like the job forces. So what India has this concept of women operated organizations, and I'm sure a lot of organizations all over the world have this concept. So maybe we could just boost that, because women know how to provide a safe environment for other working women, and there is places where people of the LGBTQ CIS plus community can be working in a safe environment with people who share experiences like them. So having like community-based employment again is a good way to combat that.
I think Dino's point just being realized that we also have to support and I think commend all these organizations that are coming in place, right? Even those startups, those community-based organizations that are trying to enable safe environments for women or the marginalized communities. And I think oftentimes when in this pursuit of trying to change, the bigger picture, we forget that there are people working that even like while we are talking, trying to bring that change into reality. So for me, a good reflection to have, and which I always do at the end of our session, is like reflect on what can I do to also be like a support to these organizations. And I think one way is definitely social media, I would say, right? Because right now on TikTok, again, I use this a lot, but I've been seeing a lot of financial transparency on TikToks. I don't know if you all have seen those TikTok videos where like a person goes around asking somebody their wages and salaries, how much they're earning, the living expenses. And actually those TikToks have actually helped others who are trying to apply for those jobs also like understand what are the expected salaries. And similarly, even like these organizations, the boost in community-based organizations is seen mostly on TikTok as well. So I think supporting them on social media, their advocacy content is important. I personally work for NGOs like that as well, who try to do social media advocacy for education for marginalized communities. And so I just realized that there's a lot that we can do that doesn't require us to like fight the government, the patriarchy at the most, like radical level. Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, I think it's equally important to have like male allies or like as important as it is to have like women kind of building safe spaces for other women. It's also equally important to have men and leaders, especially because we have a lot of like male leaders. So I think we should take that into account as well. So to have a conversation where they also are aware of what's happening and are kind of, encouraged to take actionable steps to that. And this is to kind of your early point on like teachers, first being held accountable as to like what they're teaching. Is it gender sensitive? Is it inclusive? I think it kind of comes down to funding as well. We know how low paid the teachers are. So it's kind of a full circle moment where, again, going back to this point of conflict as well. We know a lot of countries spend so much more money on their defenses than education. And I feel like it keeps constantly kind of reducing, like that, at least that's the case for my country. It has consistently been reducing, like from the GDP, the amount of funding they have towards education. I think that's very telling as well. Yeah.
This is kind of unrelated to the gender aspect, but I was thinking about what Ritu was saying about ethno-linguistic minorities and about access to education from a language perspective. So I just want to kind of put that in there. So coming from the US, I'm from Florida, like a third of our population speaks Spanish at home, but none of our education system is in Spanish. And so I think that's a huge, just straight up like barrier to entry for education and employment. Is you're not teaching people the language they will work in. Like in Miami, you speak Spanish more than you speak English, but you're not actually taught in Spanish. And the same thing I think goes for other countries. I worked a lot in Haiti, and in Haiti, the language is Haitian Creole, but all the education system is in standardized French. And it's such a huge barrier to entry, especially for people from impoverished communities who don't have access to formalized French standard education, that they cannot even enter the education system, they cannot enter the job market because they don't even speak the language that their government says is the formal language of education, because they speak Creole at home. And I think that's something to also input. And my partner is Egyptian, and he was saying that the class of like the education system is like the higher class you are in Egypt, the more you get trained in English. And so if you're from an indigenous community from the desert, or if you're from, a wealthy neighborhood in Cairo, you can, you aren't necessarily taught in Arabic, taught in English, and all of these different linguistic things that are barriers to like standardized education that is not universal across countries or communities. But I'm not sure quite how to standardize that, right? You have to have like you want people to be like in a globalized context to be able to speak to people of other, nationalities, but I'm also not sure, because they aren't like necessarily the capabilities or the resources to translate everything into every, indigenous language, every minority language that exists. Like, especially in the US, we have, how many people from how many different countries. You can't translate everything into every language. So I'm wondering about like capacity building, like how can you capacity build at the education level? So just to throw that in there, not to derail the discussion from gender, but to input like a linguistic aspect on it.
Yeah, I think this, but Kit, this I think it also goes with gender, right? Intersectionality in gender recognizes that it's not just your gender identity, but even your socioeconomic status, your religion, your ethnicity, the language you speak, the place that you're born, and all of that. So I think it's important to take into account that our lived experiences are going to be very different, and we're just like 6 people here as the fellows, and 2 more people added to it. But beyond that, there's so many other groups of people who face the same issue at a different level. And I personally think that whenever we come up with these policies, and I know that the policies cannot really accommodate all of them, but it's important to put all of our voices as part of that discourse, dialogue that you think about or that you involve in before a policy is being made, especially at an education level. That's where I was mentioning how recognizing that there are these differences in the experiences that people are having, is the first way to go about, because that's where like the problems and the solution that you can come up with. And I think oftentimes we don't do that. Oftentimes we are so into like this concept of like, okay, we want to have an inclusive environment, but we already have a safe environment. Most, I think, be it in the political sector or in an educational sector, most people are so focused, or most institutes are so focused in promoting that face, that image of like, okay, we're really good, we're really inclusive, that they want to hide all these issues under the rug. And that's where more children who are from the minority communities are marginalized, discriminated, face the brunt of the unequal spaces. And I think that at a policy level, that's what we could start with. And
Oh, just a quick addition to that. I'm really glad, Kate, you brought this up, the language issue, because speaking for my country, India has 29 official languages that are spoken throughout the country, and more than 128 different dialects throughout the nation. So we have this like national education system where we are taught in Hindi, which is our one of our national languages, official languages, and the other one is English. But we also have state boards that have language-specific education, because we are divided by linguistic states. So each state basically has its own language. So the state board of education it gives you education in the language of the state. But where this comes as a barrier is when people pursue higher education. So let's say at a university level, when the number of state-affiliated universities are less, and all you get is like education in English mostly, or if you extend it a little bit in Hindi. So what we could do is, if we could extend this like state language-based education or like local language-based education to even the higher education system. So let's say have more universities have courses that are available in the native languages. I think that would be a really effective step towards being more inclusive for those communities.
Absolutely. Does anyone have any other comments or questions? I have on the schedule just like further discussion and last questions. And so I created some like guiding questions for our guest mentors that I figured we could really use the remaining time to kind of really dig into your expertise. If that's all right with you guys. So I guess we've talked a lot about financial literacy. And so I'm really curious, Nathasha, could you further explain what financial literacy is to all of us, but also how does it okay, sorry, my brain is like all over the place. Why is financial literacy particularly important for young women? I think specifically, and we've had this huge conversation about gender. I think it's really important to continue this discussion. So if you could maybe start us off with that, I guess.
Yes, can relate to the kind of being all over the place. I think my ADHD is acting up. But so like, yeah. So maybe I'll start with like financial literacy. What does it mean? And yeah. So, or do I start with how it is? I think I'll start with how it's important. I think that's probably that will help us to go with the flow of the conversation. To give you a bit of background as to like why I'm interested in this, like my personal story with it, is that I've never once had a conversation about like money with my family. And when I talk to my other friends at university, I think that was kind of a common theme as well. And so considering how important money is in our day-to-day lives, and, you know, a lot of things are kind of revolving around money as well, and not to kind of put down value of other things which are equally important, but then I think money does affect a lot of us in a lot of different ways. So, but we've never once had conversations surrounding this topic of like finances, your personal finances, your money, like how do you handle money and all that. And I thought that was very strange. And especially when I kind of graduated university, and then I'm like put into this, you know, there's like unpaid internships, but then you have to have an internship to kind of do a job. So there's this whole kind of, in one aspect of things, I'm like, I wasn't financially stable at all, like graduating university. So I'm in this like stressful situation where I'm like, how do I earn money, and, you know, how do I get on with my life? How do I support my family and all that? But then there's also the other side to it where I'm like, it's kind of like my university, like empowering and all of those values acting on me. I'm like, why is this such a common issue? And how do I find like a solution to this, that sort of thing? So there's that. I think we can all agree that there's a lack of resources on financial literacy. And also, I think something that I noted was that you have resources out there, like if you were to search for what is financial literacy, or how do I manage my personal finances, you will find resources, but then those are mostly kind of based off of like the US or European models. And that's great. And that's a great starting point as well. But then there's such a lack of financial resources that are adapted to our own countries, our own cultures. Like, just to give you an example, the credit system that's there in like the US, we don't have it in our country. And I'm not sure if other Asian countries, maybe some of them don't have it either. So, you know, like there's such differences when it comes to your own personal finances, depending on which country you are. The tax works different. There's so many things that are different. And these are things that are very important to you as a young adult, but then these are not talked about enough even not at a university level, which I found was very surprising. So that's one, like lack of resources on like financial literacy that are adapted to like our differences, like within Asia. And we also have to kind of connect it to gender. We also have first of all, we have a global gender gap when it comes to just like economic empowerment in general. Men have, like a lot of men have more economic rights compared to women. And so there's that in like the bigger picture kind of way. But then to kind of bring it back to like my personal story, and then what I heard from my friends back at university as well, there's lack of discussion surrounding personal finances at home, universities, and that results in like less confidence as well handling money. Like I'm not sure of my economic worth, so I'm not sure how to present myself when there's like a job opportunity. For example, we're talking about how, you know, like the expected salary, what would I put there? And that framing, like to even know and be aware of that, you need to have some sort of awareness in financial literacy. I do think it's a life skill to have for everybody, regardless of like your gender or where you come from. And also, if you think about it, like in our context, in my country, the place that you go to for personal finances is the bank, you know? But the bank has its own agenda. They're a business at the end of the day, you know, they are a profit-making business. So they wouldn't necessarily advocate for you. So you have to do that for yourself. You have to advocate for your own personal, better financial decisions. And like I mentioned before as well, like the financial decisions that you're making in the future, definitely kind of in one way or another, I think it draws from like what you learn as a young adult as well. And it's really important to kind of have those practices. So being able to advocate for yourself when it comes to like modern banking, and because that's the main source of financial knowledge available out there in like our countries at least, and being able to negotiate salaries as a young adult. So those are all kind of points as to why like financial literacy is important. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that was kind of my framing on financial literacy.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And Shoni, I actually have a question for you as well. For like as a policy consultant, I'm wondering what are the biggest like financial and economic challenges facing, or in your opinion, I guess, facing young people today, and specifically in South Korea, but also how does it differ between South Korea and other countries in Asia?
Can you repeat the question real quick?
Oh, sorry.
What's the biggest challenge
what do you think are the largest financial and economic challenges facing young people today, specifically in South Korea, but also how it differs between South Korea and other regions in Asia?
Interesting. So it's a really good question. I think a trap that South Korea has fallen into is one of education, actually. And it's one of a sort of blind infatuation with higher education and the idea that a university degree would automatically get you a good paying job. And this is largely, I think, an unintended consequence that has been born out of like our parental generation from back in the 70s and 80s who graduated university and college then, where the university matriculation rate was only at 20-30% of the entire workforce population, which meant that if you graduated from a college with a degree, you were automatically in the top 20% of the workforce, right? But that's no longer the case. I think, if I'm not mistaken, South Korea has the highest rate in terms of university matriculation. I think it's north of 70% if you're talking about four-year college universities. And if you also count online degrees and online universities, that number shoots up to 80 something percent. So we're talking about 8 out of 10 Korean youths enrolling in college. Whether or not they graduate is a whole new story. But now this presents a whole new problem, I think, for not just the people who go to college and pay all that money to spend 4 years of their prime learning things that perhaps they didn't want to learn in the first place. They went to college because everyone else is doing that, right? That's one thing. And employers are now faced with the issue of how do we differentiate the real cream of the crop from the rest of the pack, right? Because everyone now has graduated with a 4-year degree from a major university. Now every higher education institution brands itself as a prestigious elite institution. So that the question of how do we make differentiate, I think the applicants is a huge issue, and that just creates bigger costs, I think, for people who are looking for jobs, because now they have to compete for even better qualifications and even better qualifications as years go by. So I would like to emphasize that higher education is certainly important. But if you take a look at, I think, the other Northeast Asian countries like China and Japan, where education is also really important, but they're not, in my mind, they're not as infatuated with it the way South Korean public is. And it's not always, the more the merrier. So just wanted to put that out there. And then there are other factors in play as well, but, I don't want to go on for too long at once. So I'll just cut it off there.
So the last question I had is for both of you. And so kind of like, given that we are like solution building, I suppose, there's been a lot of talk about like universal basic income in recent years. And so I'm wondering what your approaches to UBI is from your different fields, and whether or not you think it's an actual solution to youth unemployment and poverty. Whoever can go first. Yes, I can choose someone, I guess. Shoni, since you were already talking, let's just continue.
I actually don't have a whole lot of, new things to say about UBI. UBI was interesting enough. UBI was mentioned as an official policy platform of one of the major presidential candidates in our most recent election, just several months ago. It was actually iterated by the current head of the opposition party. So it's a conversation that is being had. I think the public favorability approval rating for that policy is still very low, because we are, in a way, a Confucian society that still puts a lot of emphasis on hard work and getting and meritocracy. And UBI just kind of seems a little detached from that notion of how we have organized our economic realities around. But I would say that the proponents of UBI in South Korea do argue that sort of with a basic income, those unattractive jobs, so to speak, would necessarily have to be better paid over the long run. And then the working conditions would also improve. And these two things are of utmost importance, I think, to people in South Korea who care about labor conditions and working conditions. So people still would have to do a lot of these jobs without, need and reducing some of the welfare trap concerns that the conservative side has about UBI. I think that's sort of the tension there is between I don't want to have to sort of divide in terms of ideological camps, so to speak, but it really is an issue that divides the conservatives from the progressives or the liberals in South Korea, at least. And the progressives who have argued for UBI in the past generally argue along these lines. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to be uncovered here, but it still needs a lot more work in terms of fine-tuning the policies and how we're going to manifest it in the policy circles.
I'm wondering, does it have any relation to, like, during COVID? I know the South Korean government gave a lot of stipends. Are those conversations related to each other, or?
I don't think the Korean government saw COVID as a permanent state of affairs, which means that they saw this as a shock treatment to a pandemic that no one saw coming. So I think the kind of injections that the previous government made into the market during the COVID era, we can still arguably say that we are living in the COVID era, but some people would kind of like to frame it as a post-COVID era now. But so yeah, I don't think people conflate those two and consider them to be the same things. I think UBI is in fact another wholly different conversation that is being had, but there's very little support for UBI among sort of the establishment political circles. There are very few major politicians who speak of UBI as something that is actually attainable and realizable in, say, the next decade or so.
Nathasha, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, not a lot of thoughts on UBI, but I think maybe just a few points to add. I wonder if I think it can help in reducing these inequalities that we see as well, with access to education and when it comes to opportunities like job opportunities and things like that as well. But I think coming from a country that barely has a lot to, a lot of government money to work with, I think it's a bit unrealistic to certain countries, and a lot of countries at that, I think, in the world, to implement this. So not sure where that makes us stand with. Yeah. I just don't think it's realistic coming from the point of like being Sri Lankan and knowing how our government works and how much money we have. Yeah.
Absolutely.
If I can just add one bit. In fact, I think it was in either 2016 or 2017, the opposition party leader that I spoke of earlier, he was the head of a province called, or the city called Seongnam in South Korea, which is kind of attached to Seoul. So it's, sort of considered to be in the greater metropolitan area, major city. And while he was mayor, he did initiate and implement what is sort of like a pilot program version of UBI. I think it roughly translates to the Youth Allowance Program, and it specifically targeted a certain age bracket demographic of the Seongnam city, and it turned out to be hugely successful. But the issue is the critics of this program say it's hard to gauge whether the success, the economic success that was had by the city of Seongnam was due to this youth allowance program, which framed itself as a sort of pilot program of the UBI, or was it just overall macroeconomic and microeconomic conditions, being favorable for Seongnam that year? So I think one of the key sort of challenges for a lot of these macro questions is it's very hard to run an experiment, right? By singling out all the irrelevant variables and just like trying to figure out how X impacts Y. It's not how economies work, and there are a million different factors and variables at play. So I think one of the issues is it's very hard to run like a pristine pilot program or social experiment with some of these very experimental and innovative ideas. But I think it's important to try them out and try and see how they unfold in different cultures and different settings and different demographics, and then try to come up with sort of an amalgamated data set by combining all those different experiences. Korea has had that experience once back in 2016, but nobody has bothered to follow up. But I think it is important to try and follow up and see if it fails or succeeds in the long run. And if it fails, then we're just going to have to come up with a different arrangement for an era and a time when I think it was Jeremy Lifkin who said, end of work, right? There would be a time when the vast majority of the jobs we know today would be automated, fourth industrial revolution, AI taking over a lot of the work that we do. So we for sure have to prepare for that era. Whether UBI is the answer to that question is, I think, still up in the air.